If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. In this episode, I want to explore what we mean when we say we don't like to work, or we don't like our work, or we don't like a task. And this was spurred in a conversation. I was having a group conversation, and a buddy of mine, Justin Janowski, captured this thinking recently, and he was saying, talking about a task, it didn't feel like work. It felt like hanging out with friends and having discussions. Now, the punchline here is he was referring to recording marketing videos in an all-day session, which is something that a lot of people might roll their eyes about. But he said it didn't feel like work, and that, of course, caused me to sit up and take some notice. I firmly believe that the evidence shows that our feelings about something have a huge impact on our experience with it. And what I mean is, if we expect something to make us unhappy, it's very likely that it will. Whether that expectation is founded in experience or it's founded in some other mindset, doesn't matter. It's another question. So here's how it works. Our brains are prediction machines. They predict things to be a certain way, and absent some compelling reason to disbelieve that prediction, then we tend to perceive what that prediction is. And by compelling evidence, of course, I mean visual evidence or environmental evidence, that sort of thing. And I think, therefore, that one of the primary obstacles for us making progress and being happy and being good in our career is our feelings about work. And I want to test the hypothesis that maybe there's some sort of cultural notion around work being a bad thing. And we'll see how far we can get in this episode. I'd like to break down the don't like part and see what it actually is. The spoiler here, I think there's significant evidence that not only do we not dislike work, but we truly love to work. And the question then becomes, why do we say we don't? Following that line of reasoning, if we can stop disliking work or decrease our dislike of our work, maybe we can be more productive and engaged and generally happier about our lives. So there's a couple of things I'll say here. One is we'll talk about what work is and where it stands for us in the, let's say, broader scope of human experience. And I'm going to say when it comes to work, our experience is really fascinating. It's really interesting to see what work is about in our life. Now, let me reiterate that when I say work, I mean the application of ourselves, either physically or mentally or emotionally, to create some result in the world or some result in our own lives. Doing things to receive dollars is work. Doing things so your yard looks nice is work. Doing things so you have a good relationship with important people in your life is work. Doing things that produce happiness for ourselves, that produce a particular emotional state for ourselves, is also work. Clearly, I don't attach work to physical effort only. Instead, work is the thing that happens when we produce our intent. Our activity, either physical or intellectual, produces a result in the world or in ourselves. And that's what I mean when I say work. On that basis, there's several indications that work is really something that's good, enjoyable, attractive for us. And I've come up with 4 different ideas here. For the first one, let me say that I'm a Christian. Therefore, I'm an intelligent design guy and more likely a straight-on creationist. So I believe we were made rather than evolved, but the result in this area is the same. So this is about the environment that we find ourselves in. I'm talking about the universe and the earth and the world and Our reality is one where we can have deep impact on our environment through the mechanism of taking raw material and turning it into things. We have the ability to shape things to our own desires. Now, animals have this to a lesser degree, but we humans have it in spades. I mean, we take stuff and get really crazy with it. We go to the beach and there's sand, so what do? We make sand castles, and that's cool. We look at animals, in many cases, they can be trained and domesticated, and we work to do that. And even the stuff itself, rocks, trees produce wood, and we've learned how to acquire wood and how to shape it. So we live in this environment where we can affect the world. We can bring forth things that are not readily apparent in the materials themselves. Wood is an example. We carve wood and we turn it into designed things. We turn it into decorative things. It once looked like a tree and it doesn't look like a tree anymore. And that's a thing we humans do. Lots of things fall into this heading of things that aren't readily apparent. And one that I'll use is coal. I think it's a good example because there's nothing to me about coal that makes it look like it would burn, but it does. In fact, it produces a huge amount of energy. And it's a pretty convenient source of the huge amounts of energy that we utilize. Somebody did work to figure that out. Somebody exercised their human attribute of working and creating and made something that didn't exist previously. And that's the nature of the reality that we find ourselves in. We can do these sorts of things. We have imagination and can manipulate things, dexterity, all these things that help us. And this is a distinctly human advantage over the animals, at least in orders of magnitude. Of course, animals can impact their environment and they do some things, but the degree to which we can do it as humans makes it a whole different category of creativity. So at some level, we're made to work. We're made to influence our environment. And we're in an environment that we can directly influence. We can manipulate the things in our environment. The second idea, I think we're drawn to work. I think psychologically, something in our human makeup, in our psyche, pushes us to engage with the situations that we see. And again, I'm going to use the word environment, although it doesn't just mean the external environment. We engage with the environment to turn it into what we think it should be. And we have this compulsion to do this. We see it in children, we see it in grown-ups, we see it clearly in our sense of boredom, we see it in our sense of enthusiasm. We really like doing these things. And left to our own devices, I think most of us will find some way to take something into the world and turn it into something else we like better. We're simply psychologically motivated to do it. I mean, we'll hum a song or whistle a tune if nothing else is going on. We'll invent things to do. Look at games, entertainment, sports. We invented these ideas just so we had things to do that produce results in the world. We're really just drawn to it. And I find that fascinating about us and about our work. I think the third thing about work is that work is the way that we as humans achieve results in the world. And this is a little bit different than what I was talking about before. Before it was the environment is amenable to the things that we do. But this is the mechanism by which we get what we want. And again, we're innately driven to achieve results. We're consistently dissatisfied with what we see, maybe not in a real grumpy sense, but at least in a, wow, I think that could be better sense. So we take our own effort and our volition and our dexterity and all these different things and try to turn our environment into things that suit us better. However you measure suit us better. And that's where we get results. We are goal and results driven critters. And the means to do that is work. Sometimes it's mental work, sometimes it's physical work, but we see a state of the world, we observe a state of it, and we don't like it. And we want a result that's different from that state. And so we work and we get these results, this change. And that's what work does for us in our world and for us as humans. And I'll say the fourth thing is that our system of distribution of goods and material things is based on work, economically and culturally. Now, it's not really a surprising conclusion, but I'm not sure if you thought about it at this level. It could be the distribution of goods and material things could be and has been based on something else other than just your work. In the past, you owned things because you were born to own things. You had all the stuff and nobody else had stuff. And so they had to come to you to get the stuff. And if you wanted to give them stuff, you gave them stuff. And we call these people kings, and they're mostly gone at this point. At present, the economy is such that in the West, and particularly in America, we work to get the economic things that we need and want. And the medium of that is dollars. So we work in the economy to get dollars that we then exchange for things that we need and want. So that's four ideas around this larger notion that we're made to work. We live in an environment where work is a thing. The stuff is there that we can manipulate. Psychologically, we're drawn to it. We dislike boredom. We look at the world and say, it could be different. We like to have those results in the world. And it's this goal-driven thing that we have. And then finally, that's the way we've designed our economic system, so that you produce things in the world, you work, and then the things that you produce get you other results. So all of this means that this work thing is something that's innately human. Now, it's not just drudgery all the time, and that's what I want to get down into. We say we don't like to work, but many of us work very, very hard to achieve results that are not financial in nature. And I think many of our results, at least in the modern economy, can be turned into financial results. I mean, if you really love fishing, then you can really, really make a good living as a fisherman. You can make a living as a commercial fisherman, or you can make a living as a sport fisherman, if that's what you like, enjoy, and want to do. Now, there's a lot more people that do it than people who can actually do it for money in a lot of these activities. And we'll talk about these different categories of work. So, despite these four things that we talked about, we often say that we don't like to work. And I just want to know what that means. Let's look at that and dissect that and see if we're being clear or if we're just falling into some sort of a cultural mindset. So now we've talked about these things that mean that we're here to work. And I'm going to now flip that over and I'm going to say that there's four kinds of work that we do, four categories that I think are pretty easily identifiable. And we're going to use this to kind of break down this whole notion of why do we dislike it when we're made to do it? Now, when we use the word work, there's lots of things we could mean, and I'm going to use these categories to divide things out so we can have clarity on what we're thinking about. So the most prominent category when people use the word work in the West and in America, they're most likely to mean what they do for a living. They go to an office or they have a business or they have a job and it's their economic engine. And most people, when they say work, that's what they mean. It's where we get our economic power, our income. For this first category of work, our goals are primarily economic or financial. Even getting better at our career often has an end goal of being more successful, and that's typically measured in terms of dollars or dollars per unit of work, per unit of time. And so that's this first category, and that's an easy one. A lot of people mean when they say work, right? They mean this economic thing. Oh, I got to go to work. So we've got that identified. There's a second class of things that's often called work, and that's chores, household stuff, maintenance stuff that we do in order to take care of our possessions, take care of the other people around us, take care of our relationships. So that's chore, and the word has a negative connotation, kind of mundane, beneath me kind of work. But I'm using it in a more generic sense than that. So let's not let that negative sense carry over. Chore is the name for the things that we're compelled to do because we have things in our lives. We have to keep the yard nice. We have to keep the house nice, cleaning, cooking, these things. And we say things like, well, I've got to work on the yard when I get home. And yeah, I can't go fishing on Saturday because I've got to paint the garage door. So these chores are things that we do instead of other things. I think the goal for chore kinds of things is problem avoidance. And this is particularly avoiding problems with the people and things in our lives. We typically don't get financially rewarded for the chore kinds of things we do. We do get rewarded by meeting some standard or having confidence that something is well taken care of. And so that's how we get rewarded from chore. Things don't break, or we feel like we've met some standard. I'll say hobby is the third category. And this category is things that we do simply because we want to. They're not typically financially driven. In a lot of ways, the goal is the activity itself, to be able to keep doing it or to do it better, or just to engage with it a lot of times. Fishermen will say things like, a bad day fishing is better than a good day working. And that indicates that it's not a results-driven activity, although we do notice results. It just means that they'd rather be fishing and catch nothing than working and make money. Now, I don't know how accurate that trade-off actually is, but it does express the emotion around hobby pretty well. With hobby, the goal is to keep playing, to keep producing the result, to get better at producing that result, either more adept at producing the same result or the same effort in producing better results. And this one's really interesting because hobbies can be quite hard work. A lot of people that exercise are in this category, people who run. And in this case, the only term for their running is a hobby. It's certainly beyond anything that a doctor would prescribe for them to be healthy, right? So some number of steps per day keeps you healthy, 5,000, 10,000, whatever it is. That's fine. There is no doctor that says, well, you need to run a marathon once a month to keep in good physical health. The bar is much, much lower than that. But I know folks that run anyway. And so that to me runs it over into this hobby category. And even among runners, I don't know anybody that doesn't recognize the pain of physical kinds of endeavors. And by pain, I mean tiredness, soreness, and then also sucking up huge amounts of time. I mean, athletic hobbies can be quite hard work. I mean, running, sheesh. My own example is I was a golfer, and there's both physical exertion, not to mention a sore back quite often, and really kind of warm, sweaty golf in Alabama in the summer. And there are components of it which are not pleasant, which we wouldn't choose, but we still do it. And I find that interesting that we'll pursue our hobbies even when it's uncomfortable. Hunters will go out in weather I'd just as soon not experience in order to pursue their hobby. Hobby is also interesting because there's likely some frustration And by that, I mean that we have an intent and we have goals, and our means of implementing those goals doesn't produce those goals. So frustration is we go out to do something and it doesn't work out. And it's a little bit of a hard thing to define, but it comes in and it makes our hobby, I'm going to say, hard work. And I bring this out to say that the difficulty of the work is not necessarily an indicator of how we feel about them. A lot of people work harder on their hobbies than they do in their workplace. More blood, sweat, toil, and tears around their hobby than in their workplace. And I find that really fascinating because that indicates that it's not the challenges of the work that determine how much we pursue it. So that's the third category, is hobby. So then the fourth and final category is this notion of entertainment and amusement. And of course, in the Western world, particularly the US, this is a big deal in terms of the amount of time we invest in, particularly, I mean, television watching stats are staggering. So when we look at entertainment and amusement, the two words are very similar in meaning. But let me clarify that amusement is the feeling or state or emotion that is produced by entertainment. So entertainment produces amusement. I will say the etymology of these words is really interesting. It goes back a couple hundred years. Amusement used to mean something like dumbfounded or stupefied or puzzled. And now amused means more or less pleasantly engaged with sort of a light positive emotion. And there's also some sense of surprise and novelty often in the feeling of amusement. So we go to an entertainment to be amused, and amusement has a lot to do with emotion. As an example, we watch sports so that we can get emotional about it. We get fired up and we can have opinions and feel these strong emotions. The presence of story is a big indicator of an entertainment. Is there a story here? Is there a plot line? And I'll say if story is involved, it's a signal that the activity might be entertainment. Humans are engrossed by story. Stories are how we make meaning in the world. Also, story is an end in itself. We're entertained. We're amused by a story entertainment. So in this fourth class, the goal is to achieve or maintain some feeling or emotion or some sense of being stimulated emotionally or intellectually in those areas. And it's a little bit hard to nail down because we also get into this category when we're just trying to avoid boredom. We'll slide into something like entertainment when we don't have anything else to do, just to be occupied. Also, entertainment and amusement overlaps with some notions of rest and recreation. The culture tells us that resting involves sitting, and while we're sitting, we might as well engage in an entertainment so that we can be amused. After all, it's better than being bored, right? Now, I'll say that good rest and recreation are more like a hobby or maybe even a chore than they are an entertainment or amusement. But that's just me trying to distinguish between these different categories. We spend lots of resources in order to be amused. So going to the movies is a thing that we at least used to do. So we're intentionally engaging in an entertainment. And it got to where it was pretty expensive. So we'll spend a whole stack of cash to be pleasantly entertained for a couple of hours, maybe 2.5, so that we're amused. Now, this one may be the biggest stretch to apply the word work to, but I'm going to take it because entertainment and amusement is an intentional use of time and resources, and it's goal directed, so it fits our definition. We want to be amused. So we participate in an entertainment. And sometimes that requires resources, including money, and it almost always requires some of our time. As I alluded to, a lot of our media consumption fits in here. Probably the second most valid category that social media and the internet falls into would be hobby. But in a lot of cases, it falls into simply entertainment. And for me, the distinction is the goal. A hobby usually produces an external result in the world, not just an emotional feeling. On the dark side, if you will, of amusement is when the only goal is to avoid boredom, to occupy our skull. When we're bored, we tend to choose the path of least resistance, and we don't have other goals for the consumption of media. I think, again, this is a cultural thing. Americans consume a lot of media, and nominally, it's for informational purposes. But I think it's really for satisfying our base level of curiosity, even if that curiosity is artificial. I think it'll be important for me to be clear about what I mean by artificial curiosity. Artificial curiosity is created by media. You weren't curious about what a social media influencer had to say before there was some provocative signal that they had said something. So the entertainment value is self-creating. It's a cycle of increasing attention consumption. Entertainment, amusement is the fourth category. Now, the reason that we break this out into these four classes, I couldn't find a way to map them onto the four things previous about how we're workers, but that set up this notion of we're made to work. The world is a workable thing. We might enjoy work, but we typically will say we don't like to work. We get results from work. So why do we say we dislike it? I think the four categories then have different emotions attached to them. And I'd say we kind of delved into that a little bit as I was describing it. If you look at the range of human emotion, both positive and negative, work generally will produce some emotions in attention in addition to consuming time and possibly other resources. Some of those resources are this tiredness, this energy that we've used, physical or mental, frustration, some emotional energy that we use. That's when we don't get the results that we expect. Also, there's some notion of contentment that's in this emotional thing. We produce contentment in a sense of accomplishment and lack of a sense of boredom, among other things. Recall, we're talking about boredom, recall that amusement is pleasantly occupied, okay, producing generally positive or at least interesting emotions for us. Amusement is delivered with funny puppy videos and with scary movies. Amusement is watching sports sometimes. Amusement is engagement with a loved one. It's all these things that really pleasantly affect our mental energies. So all these feelings circle around in these four different kinds of work. All these positive and negative emotions are in these four different kinds of work. Now, I will say that dislike is a value judgment more than it is an emotion. Dislike tends to center around the first and second category, around the I've got to work to produce my economic results, and I've got to work to meet the standards for my environment. And that's interesting. And maybe that's the difference between the idea of a chore and the idea of a hobby. Because chores are to meet some external standard, and hobby really meets an internal standard. Take yard work, for example. There's one kind of yard work that's done to keep the HOA off your back. There's another kind of yard work that's done because you really love grass. It's all the same height, and you get satisfaction out of having a beautiful lawn. That's something that has meaning to you. Now, we're deep down into individual human psyche stuff. It gets a little bit weird. a little bit different from person to person. There are people that just love growing things. They spend lots of time and effort, blood, sweat, toil, and tears, having the growing things grow in ways that meet their own internal standard. Now, when we get into hobby, I don't know that the standard is completely internal, but we ourselves individually are in control of the results of meeting or not meeting that standard. Now, this is really different compared to the first two areas of work, particularly the first category, economic work, where we're not in control. Other people are in control. When we get into this chore thing, it's not for money, typically, but it's for meeting an external standard. And thus, a lot of times it gets frustrating. We say, at least mentally, we say, I'm tired of doing this chore, but I haven't met the standard yet. So we get tired, frustrated, irritable. We think we're spending too much of ourselves to get this done. And since it's not my standard, since it's an external standard, I really wrestle with that in this chore world. So now bringing that all the way back up to the work world, which I think is the most common category we'll say we dislike. That first category, economic work, is the most common producer of dislike about what we're doing. Now, chores do most often come in a quick second. But it's interesting that the commonality between those two is that the standard is external to us. It's not a standard of our own making. If we can make the standard our own, if we can substitute our standard for the external standard, then I think we can pull this in the direction of hobby. And in many ways with hobby, the personal standard exceeds the external or cultural standard anyway. Let's look at music, for example. The cultural standard is that most people don't produce music. And so if you don't produce music, you're not thought of as some substandard human being. There are other areas where if you don't meet the standard, you are considered a substandard human being. If you don't love, cherish, and take care of the people in your life, you're considered a substandard human being. But the standard, though, is self-generated. If you're a musician, the culture doesn't expect you to be a musician, and yet you do have a standard around that. So I think that's interesting in hobby. Hobbies are like that. If you're growing your garden and you're doing your flowers right, you probably exceeded the standard of the HOA. And so I wonder if that's a clue that if we can develop our own standards that exceed those of the external standard, then we can move some areas of work and or chore into the realm of hobby, where the goal is to keep playing. Sometimes with hobby, we just want to stay engaged. So in sports or games where there's competition, elimination competition, our goal is to win this game so that we can play the next game against the next opponent. Now, Simon Sinek talked about this. He called it the infinite game, where the goal is just to continue playing in the game. He made the observation that business is an infinite game. Stay in business and produce a profit so that you can stay in business and continue to produce profit. And this area is really where hobby lives. I think in a lot of cases, if you want to investigate Simon Sinek's infinite game, I think you'll see that hobby lives in that infinite game area. And it's really interesting because all that's different between hobby and chore. The only difference between hobby and chore is control of the standard. My daughter had an experience in this area. She took up the flute as a youngster and seemed to enjoy doing it for a while. But then the expectations of performance got to be outside her own standard. And she put the flute down and hasn't touched it for close to 10 years now. I think that's a real shame because making music is something that a lot of people enjoy, and she stopped enjoying it. So here we're kind of on the flip side where A hobby got turned into a chore. I play the bass, as I've mentioned before, and it's very much in the hobby realm. But flute got to be a chore for my daughter. But for me, bass is a hobby. Now, that doesn't mean I always enjoy the process. Practicing my bass, doing scales is often drudgery, but I have the goal and the standard is my standard. I'm less prone to dislike the work. I'm more prone to understand why the work needs to be done. And I think that's a component of what we see when we see people that really love their work. A lot of times professional athletes are a prime example of people who apparently really enjoy what they do for their economic gain. But they also have these goals beyond just money that keep them going and keep them practicing and keep them trying to improve. So this idea of control, in one way, it's not a terribly surprising finding. I mean, we know about the ideas of meaning, of control, and ownership. But I think when we get down to it, the actual brass tacks is defining the standard. In this sense, mindset is very important. So who's there to stop us from developing our own standard and treating most of the things we do as hobby? Who is it that convinced us that our work for money has to produce negative feelings for us? Now, I've posted in another episode about the impact of making up our minds that we don't like something or some task. And I want to see about the flip side of that. What happens if we start taking a positive view of the things that we do? Back to Justin's, it didn't feel like work. It felt like hanging out with friends and having discussions. What if we could have that mindset in our work? Only obstacle that I'm aware of is the cultural trope, the cultural meme that, quote, work is awful. Quote. Now, this trope has a corollary that's much less obvious. And that is, if we happen to enjoy our work, then we're some brainless idiot who doesn't resent being told what to do, and every human resents being told what to do, so this is some subhuman robot. I mean, just think of our cultural images of somebody who really relishes their day-to-day. There are plenty of them in school-aged kids on TV. I mean, look at modern sitcoms and think about the people who get excited about what they do. What do they look like? How often do they get laughed at? And this is the culture putting up some sort of an idea for us. I think mindset really matters here. And I think we exert a lot more control over our mindset than we typically believe we do. And this has at least one really interesting implication. And I'm talking about defining the standard relative to work as one, at least one really interesting implication. In my work, I run into a lot of people who hire people. And the people say, well, what I really want is to hire somebody that'll take ownership of the situation and make the same kind of decisions that I make. And I will let that individual know that they've set for themselves a very, very difficult task. Because as the owner, as the boss, you have an ability that no employee has, and that is the ability to set the standard. Everybody else in your organization is trying to meet your standard. Most cases, it's not their standard, it's your standard. So one thing a boss can do that an employee can never do, a boss can say, oh, well, this is good enough, and we'll just take the risk of annoying a customer. Or, yeah, we'll take the risk of it not working. This is good enough. This is all the effort we can expend here. So let's move on to something else. Bosses can say this, employees can't. And that's actually exerting control of the standard. Perhaps correlated with this is the idea that bosses usually really enjoy their work, where employees often struggle in the area of enjoyment. And so if we're looking back on the evidence of the difference between a chore and a hobby, we notice a lot of times it's control of that standard. And I think the situation for employees is similar. And if you've ever been a manager of people, you've seen that there's a big difference between saying, hey, do the thing and let me see it before you deliver it. And you've got this. I believe in you. You can handle it. Just take care of it. It's a big difference in saying those two different things. The final thing that I'll pull out here is this notion of entertainment. When we engage in entertainment, we're looking for a result, but that result has a really low bar. Basically, that we're engaged, stimulated mentally or emotionally over some period of time. That's really intangible standard. It's really hard to put any real attributes or measurement around. Did you enjoy the movie? Well, yeah, I was entertained and amused for a couple of hours. Now, remember that the original sense of amusement is this stupefaction, this wonder. So we can be confused and still be entertained. Entertainments can confuse us. The evidence here is the number of puzzle games we have. We look at something, we go, well, I just don't know what the answer is. And we have to work through a process to solve it. Rubik's Cube, crossword puzzles, jigsaw puzzles, all these different sorts of things. We look at it and we go, oh, I don't know the answer. We're confused. And so apparently fighting through that confusion and getting a result anyway is a component of this feeling of amusement. And thus is entertaining. On the flip side, I think our curiosity is something that's really weird here. By nature, humans are opinion givers, and the word that comes to mind for me is voyeurs. We just observe other people's stuff so that we can judge it, whether that's their lives, their relationships, their modes of speech or communication, or their preferences in food or clothing. There's big business in people doing what they think is good work and everybody else judging them, saying, no, that's not good work. For example, this is the only reason you have any idea who Simon Cowell is because he judges things. Actually, I think entertainment and amusement is pretty dangerous. I think entertainment and the feeling of amusement can be addictive. And certainly our media have gone a long way towards exploring the addictive nature of information presented in these certain predictable ways. And I think we really get into trouble here. Now, when we talk about addictive, it's interesting that the other thing that might be addictive is hobby. I think people really get invested and involved in their hobbies, and that becomes a part of who they are. Now, I will say the fundamental difference is that hobby produces results in the world. It's not normally merely for the state of being amused. Typically, hobbies are doing things, perhaps physical things. For example, it's not say I can't get into a state of an amusement by playing the bass. I can and I have. It's that eventually there are other results that are produced. That's a hobby that there are opportunities to express externally, to record things and listen and to perform so that other people, i.e. my bandmates, can participate and also perform. We can do things together. Now, this is pretty different from entertainment and amusement because in entertainment, other people really only participate peripherally. Now, a fair amount of our entertainment is enhanced by other people being similarly entertained. And I don't know how that fits. If we're playing games or something like that, we need other people. But if we're watching a movie, we really don't. But we will take other people to the movie. But does talking about the movie justify the 2.5 hours it took to have something to talk about? So it's really interesting here. But the takeaway here is amusement, entertainment that produces amusement is one of the challenges to our sense of well-being and good time. I'll say economic work is another. So if we take economic work, the first category, and we increase our proficiency to the point where our standard becomes the standard, then I think we can get a pretty long way towards avoiding the dissatisfaction and dislike of work and move it in the direction of the hobby world. The bottom line is, I do think economic work can be moved out of the base work category. And when I say the base work category, I'm talking about this cultural trope or meme that we talked about earlier, this whole business of a wage slave, this poorhouse work. When we do it, our thought is, well, my economic situation is such that I have to do this thing this much, this often, in order to just meet my survival needs. And I don't like having to do that. I don't enjoy that. Well, I like to think that's a position that most of the folks in the Western world don't have to be in it. I mean, it's not like we row galleys for a living. So if we can do that, if we can move it out of this base work category, move it up to a chore maybe, then I can meet the cultural standard for this work without an overwhelming amount of discontent, frustration, and tiredness. And then I wonder if our economic work could be elevated even up to a level of hobby where we appreciate our own efforts, we set our own standard, and we feel satisfaction from achieving or even trying to achieve that standard. So I don't know that this whole notion of meaning is this terribly surprising result, but maybe it's a more actionable result. So we get meaning by owning the standard and by developing the standard in ways that we can appreciate what we're doing and be appreciated by others. So, action items. In your present job, find some things where you can set the standard. It can be simple things. Improve your typing speed. Improve your drawings. Improve your public speaking. And begin to measure your work by those things. Begin to set your own standard. Begin to be proud of accomplishing that standard. And this will help, I think, work through the mindset issues. And if we can do that, then I think it'll improve how we view the world of economic work and generally lower our stress. So to recap, we talked about 4 different reasons why we're made to work. And then we contrasted that with the notion that we say we don't like to work. But our dislike of work is confined to a couple of categories that specifically have lack of control of the standard. So I think if we can work to control the standard, and the easiest way to control the standard is by elevating your own standard above that of the external standard. And then we can begin to take pride in meeting our standard and in the work that it takes to get there. So as you're doing busy right, think about that. I think a big component of doing busy right is Justin's comment about it didn't even feel like work. It felt like hanging out with a team full of buddies and getting a result that we all wanted to have. And I think that's a great goal for us to have in our lives. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.